And Dr. Azar Jammine is the Director and Chief Economist at Econometrix. He joins us now to talk about this. A very good evening to you, Dr. Jammine. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Let's just start with a conversation we had earlier on with a political analyst on just the take of where the country is at the moment through the lens of the various political developments. And he was saying that what we're not hearing from out of all of this, including what came out of the speeches of the former presidents, was that how are we going to get through this without being able to attract international investment? I know the Deputy Minister did speak about that. Just share your thoughts with us of how important this is to get us out of the situation that we're in now.
Unfortunately, the political factionalism within the country is diverting attention away from the critical structural reforms that are needed to actually get the country's economy onto a better growth path. There's no doubt that the economic environment internationally has a very big influence on South Africa's economic performance, but the fact remains that South Africa has been underperforming the majority of major economies in the world in the last few years, and that is due to a whole host of structural impediments to growth, including corruption, including the lack of decent education of the majority of the people, which leaves them unable to add value to the economy and therefore unable to command a job and leaves them unemployed and poor. There has been far too little capital investment taking place. The level of investment in the economy has fallen to its lowest level in almost 20 years. And that includes not only foreign investors, but local investors as well. And then you have the specific issues such as Eskom, water supply, rail and port harbor inefficiencies, and you have a whole concoction of coupled with tense industrial relations. And that is a concoction that is not conducive towards higher economic growth, irrespective of what is happening overseas and the impact that that may be having on the South African economy as well.
This is what the Deputy Minister also pointed to in terms of how to create a reliable, stable environment. But as a net importer, South Africa, he says, has been forced to relook at some of its projects, which in particular have had to fall on the way, under the wayside. And I know he spoke about the July unrest as being part of the reasons, including the conflict in Russia, Ukraine. I suppose it's kind of more easy to download how we impacted because of the war in Europe. But the July unrest, has there been a comprehensive study, or are we able to even just look at the extent of the impact as a result on the economy?
I wouldn't say that the July unrest on its own has impacted massively negatively on the economy. On the contrary, it's an endogenous factor. We had the unrest in part because the economy was performing so poorly. Yes, it's added to dismay, and the one thing that it has actually brought to the fore is the inability of the country to control law, to keep tabs on law and order in crime is going, according to certain reports, totally out of control. There's been a loss of confidence in the police force, a dramatic loss of confidence in the police force and the security forces, and that was one of the results of the social unrest in July last year that came to the fore, and that has clearly also added to a reluctance to invest. With regard to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, one needs to be a little careful. In some respects, South Africa has actually been a beneficiary. The price of coal has trebled and that's a huge export item from the country. And so we have benefited, ironically, from that, just as we have suffered from the rise in food prices and fuel prices that have been exacerbated by that war. But I think one needs to be very careful not to put too much emphasis on that factor as being the most important in why we're in economic dismay at the moment. The problems that we are seeing economically at the moment have been a long time coming and have actually been with us for more than a decade.
The Deputy Minister also pointing to global inflation. Can you just explain how that impacts on individual countries? As you say, the conflict in Europe has attributed to this rise in global inflation, but you say we've been a beneficiary to some extent. Can you just explain the concept to us and how it works?
Yes, one needs to be, again, very careful in attributing the rise in global inflation entirely to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On the contrary, much of it has arisen because of years of massive fiscal and monetary stimulus by advanced economies, especially more recently to try and provide relief from COVID-19, so that when we got over that pandemic, there was a sudden rush of demand that exacerbated the supply shortages that had been caused by lockdowns all around the world. Then along came, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine that exacerbated still further some of the shortages of fuel and food in particular. And South Africa, by the way, has a much lower inflation rate than most of our leading competitors. The UK released an inflation rate of 10.1% on Monday. Ours is 7.5%. It's because we do not have the same kind of high levels of demand that are exerting upward pressure on some of our prices. So in that regard, South Africa is ironically a little better off than in the rest of the world, but it is still being obliged to raise interest rates sharply for fear of currency depreciation should it not do so, and should our interest rates not keep pace with the rise in interest rates that's happening elsewhere in the world. But we're not that badly off in terms of higher inflation compared with other countries. But nonetheless, even at 7.5%, people, the man in the street is feeling the pinch, make no mistake.
I need to ask this question. Obviously, because of COVID, the floods that we've seen, there were a lot of people who have needed the state's help. In the past, there have been those who've been cautioning against us becoming a welfare state. The Deputy Minister mentioning this, that government spends now at least 50% of its budget on social grants. Is this sustainable? How do we continue to help people at least not fall deeper into poverty, but also capacitating them to at least find employment or be entrepreneurial at some point?
You're absolutely correct in stating that it is an unsustainable program to keep spending on social grants. Having said that, a minimal amount of social grants is absolutely vital to prevent people from starving. And part of the reason for the July unrest last year was that the government's special relief package of that 350 Rand a month social grant was removed at the end of April 2021. And 3 months later, we had big unrest, partly as a result of people absolutely starving. So the government was forced to reinstate that, and it's provided, again, a little bit of a relief. But we cannot carry on indefinitely that way. The path to overcoming this is to imbue the youth with the sufficient and appropriate education to be able to add value and to become employable. The problem with our educational system at the moment is that for the majority who do not have the privilege of going to private schools or Model C schools, they are left to basically left to waste after school because their skills are just insufficient to be able to be employable in the working place. The other way, of course, entrepreneurship is a way forward, but again, you need a modicum of education to be able to understand what is needed to become an entrepreneur, and to be able to count, to know whether you're making a profit or a loss.
Well, thank you so much for your time and sharing with us your thoughts, Dr. Azar Jammine, Director and Chief Economist at Econometrix. We're going to leave it there for now. We're going to take a quick break. We're back again with more news, including the discovery of a mass grave in Malawi thought to be Ethiopians. Don't go away.